Everyone, welcome. It's so nice to be here. Before we get into discussion, shall we start with a reading from the
Yeah,
novel?
let's do it.
You can
Yes, thanks so much
set the
for
scene
coming.
for us.
It's so nice to be introduced to also like a room of people I mainly know as well. So I'm sure you all have different bios for me. For those who don't know, Jean is a novel set in 1976 in a hippie, alternative, rural boarding school in Sussex for boys with problems. And Jean is our main character. He's been kicked out of every school he's ever been to, and this is his kind of last chance. And in his final term, when his O-level exams are coming up, he strikes up a friendship with another boy there, Tom, and the book is about how that friendship turns romantic, but it's also about his feelings of alienation, his troubled relationship with his mother, who's a German Jewish refugee and an artist, and a single mother. And yeah, that's, without spoiling it, I guess that's enough. So I'm going to read from the beginning. I think the only thing you need to know is Jean is the main character, Tom is his love interest, his new friend. And we're in this kind of alternative educational space. There are lessons, but there's also a farm, and the boys do things like skin rabbits. At Compton Manor, the boys have lots of different problems. There is one who shouts swear words, and one who doesn't speak at all. If you can't hear me, let me know. All good? Okay. There are some who can't look you in the eye, and several who have asthma, and even one boy who is in a wheelchair. Jean feels sorry for him. Once his chair went missing, taken whilst he was on the toilet. He sat for 5 hours before calling for help. Then there are the boys like Jean, who, on the outside, look normal, whose illness is trapped somewhere beneath the layers of his skin. Isn't that precisely why Rosa, Jean's mother, sent Jean to Compton Manor? There was, of course, the specific event, the original crime. At Jean's last school, he stuck a compass in another boy's face. And then there were all the events, all the crimes that led up to it. Jean, 8 years old, smashes everything glass in the house. Or 12 on a Cornish beach, destroying another family's picnic. 13 and a barn is on fire. 15 and the long, stupid neck of a peacock lies limply in his hands. The boy at his last school was lucky not to lose an eye, the headmaster reported. It was bad. Even Jean can admit that. Still, the prick deserved it. But not so bad that it should have resulted in his immediate removal from normal education. It was the preceding events, all the things he had done throughout his childhood and now his adolescence, leading up to that point, and which created a sense, for Rosa and for Jean, that there truly was something irredeemably wrong with him, that caused her, finally, to send him to Compton Manor, aka House of Nutters. Once, when he was younger, a lady doctor with glasses asked him a different version of the same question. "Where does it come from?" she said, "all this anger?" He didn't know what to say. Where does the sea come from? From the rivers, the streams, the springs, and deeper, from the rocks, the sediment, the fossils, the molten centre of the earth. Of course, when Tom asked Jean what was wrong with him, Jean did not say any of this. Rather, he thought back to how the wheelchair was found submerged in the lake, one wheel broken, how he had seen Tom and Hugo shortly after, sniggering by the dormitories. Then Tom smiled, colouring slightly, and said he heard Jean might have something to smoke. Tom had sought Jean out sporadically these last few weeks, sometimes once a day, sometimes less. Jean has shown Tom how to smoke, how to crumble the cannabis and mix it with the tobacco, the soft pinch and swift roll. Jean doesn't mind that Tom is using him. He has enough to share, and it is better to smoke with someone, sometimes. At least, Jean likes smoking with Tom. Tom has shown Jean how to fish, how to tie the tackle, wrapping the line around itself, wetting the end and pulling it through. How to attach the bait, piercing the soft worm in 2 places so it doesn't slip off, and how to cast, whipping his arm back so the line reaches far across the water, a trail of expanding circles beneath. Outside of these moments together, Tom slides back into the slipstream of friends and football and classes. He doesn't ignore Jean, no. He will lift a hand if they pass in the corridor, nod to him in the dinner hall. But Tom has so many other friends. Tom likes people. He likes to laugh and slap boys' backs. He likes good, solid English fun, loud singing and ale and hunting and billiards and lots of things Jean has no idea about and no interest in. Jean doesn't mind that Tom doesn't talk to him during the day. He has his manifesto to work on, his meditation, his music. He has the problems of the universe to figure out. Jean would be lying if he said he had not noticed Tom before, but truthfully, he thought Tom was a bit of a wanker, dismissing him as one of those posh boys Jean never would and didn't want to be friends with. These days, there is a tightness in his chest and an increase in his pulse when the bell marks the end of school. The day draws to a close, and he knows he might see Tom. On the evenings that he does see Tom, they are silent at first. Slowly, Tom will talk, almost to himself, about growing up in the north in a house with grounds larger than the school, about how he shot and skinned his first rabbit when he was only 10, something all the boys learn at Compton Manor, and which Tom is so good at he has been promoted to teacher. How his father has a rifle from the First World War in the basement, and how in the lake on their land there are eels, dark, long, slimy things like dismembered arms with sharp teeth that will nip you if you fall in. About his brother George, who owns a sports car and drives fast down narrow country lanes, blasting the Beatles. Jean likes the sound of it, except for the Beatles, who he has had to tell Tom are shit. Tom has told Jean that this part of Sussex, where the school sits, is native to over at least 30 different apple trees, offering him the fruit he nicked from the kitchen garden. And it was Tom who, when the headless pigeon carcass fell from the sky, told Jean that peregrine falcons were roosting on the school roof, eating the brains of smaller birds. Jean has told Tom things too. How in London you can go to a party and stay out all night, following the movement of feet, how upstairs there are the punks and downstairs there are the rastas, and how it's fine until the skinheads show up. Jean told Tom how in Wing Chun you use your opponent's force against him. You must protect your centre and establish a bridge, a point of contact between the arms, because information travels quicker through touch than by sight. If your opponent retreats, you must follow, keeping close. If the force is too great, then you must move, restructuring the fight, so you are always poised, perfectly balanced. It is not about the force of your punch, but about the speed and mass of your body. Like a bird, Tom had said. Yes, Jean said, like a bird, but if a skin has a knife, it is better to just run. Thank you.
Maddie, thank you so much for that reading. I feel like it really captures both the angst and the longing that's in this novel. Those both feel like things that are really woven throughout it and kind of key to Jean's experience. I love this novel. I read it for the first time a few weeks ago, and it's really lingered. The characters and the atmosphere you create are so distinctive and unforgettable. And I know it's something that will stay with me for a long time. And you've talked about the fact that this was a novel that took you years to write. And I'd love to hear a bit to begin with about how you found this story, or how it found you.
Yeah, so it did take years, which I also think is a really normal length of time for a novel to take, or anything.
Yeah.
It's very loosely inspired by a family member who disappeared before I was born. So when I came to write this book, I kind of had the mess of, or the chaos of life, and I was trying to figure out what my way in would be, what my frame was. And initially it was quite different. Well, it wasn't quite different. There was always a section that focused very closely on this figure of Jean, who I knew I wanted to write about, a teenage boy who felt at odds with the world, who was alienated from it, who struggled to sort of comprehend the civilized paradigms that everyone else could follow, who struggled to connect with his mother, and who also was struggling with his own sort of identity and sexuality. But I wasn't quite sure how to tell that story, and because I grew up with stories about this person, they were kind of projections and images of someone. And as I was writing, there were three different sections. There was this section of Jean, and then there was also a section from his mother, Rosa, and then there was a section set 40 years later with a young woman sort of called Waddy or whatever.
Who could that be?
Yeah, who could that be? Going through a breakup in London. But those narratives, you know, I needed to write them to understand a sort of external image, but as I was writing it became clearer and clearer to me that what I wanted to do was kind of get behind that and try and write from the inside out. I mean, that is why it's in third person, though. I don't think I could ever write from like truly internally from the first person. But that's how the story kind of initially came, and then the kind of broader editing process of making it narrower.
I'm really interested in what you said about choosing not to write it in first person. Was there a sense that it almost was like you needed a level of distance from the story or from the character in order to be able to find the truth in his experience or his perspective?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is like writing a perspective that was so different from my own, you know, that was a different age, gender, sexuality and time period, meant that there's a lot of there's an imaginative leap that needs to be made. So it was like, you know, I had a lot of questions as I was writing it, but also Jean's particular character is, I think now we would call him neurodivergent. He's definitely dyslexic. He's probably autistic. He has symptoms of schizophrenia. He definitely sees the world in a different way, and part of his problem is that the main mode of communication, i.e. language, is not something he's that comfortable with. So if I were to write it in the first person using that material of language, I wouldn't be able to express the things I wanted to express. It wouldn't feel authentic to use the words, the descriptions, the kind of understanding. So I needed that hovering, the hovering distance where we dip into his thoughts, but there's also the ability to kind of reflect on them in the narrative and to basically use long words, if I wanted to.
Gives you the freedom to use the words you've chosen.
Exactly.
It feels, you know, within that distance, there's a real intimacy in the novel. I think we feel so close to his experiences at points, and then further away at others. And And there is a sense that he is marked out in the landscape of the novel and in Compton Manor and the world that he finds himself in. And I wanted to talk a bit about his name. What I love about his name and the name of the novel is that it sort of presents you with a decision from the off about how you pronounce it. Is it Jean? Is it Jean? And there's a sense that he has a kind of indeterminacy or an otherness even in the landscape that he's in. And it feels like the name sort of confronts us with that from the off. It sounds like it could be a woman's name, a French name. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you came to name him and why.
So the name was one of the first things I had, and I knew that I wanted it to have this kind of instability embedded in it. So his name is Jean. His mother, Rosa, is a German Jewish refugee, but she's a huge Francophile. She comes to the UK and, like many refugees at that time, completely rejects the nationhood from whence she came. And so she gives her son this sort of aspirational name. It's a reflection on her own aspirations and the world and space she'd like to be part of. But obviously it doesn't really translate in a very upper class English boarding school setting. So what happens is he's called Jean, which is the girl's equivalent. And that was very deliberate to kind of make him not to emphasize or enhance or embody the lack of stability he feels in himself, and also this sort of sense that he carries the projections of others, that it's hard for him to kind of establish his own identity because there are these projected images on him. And yeah, it does mark him out in a way. But I think this sense of victimhood that Jean has is also meant to be, on the one hand, it's very real. Growing up different at any time is hard, and his particular difference is accentuated in the time period. But there's also, I think, we're very much in his closed mind, close in his mind in the novel, and there are moments when I sort of want to trouble it, where I want to show that he has this sense of otherness that isn't necessarily true. There's a moment where he realizes that all of the other boys in the school have something else that marks them out. One of them doesn't have a father, another boy is mixed race, someone else's father is an artist, and obviously they're all in a school for boys with problems. So it's kind of like trying to toe that line between him being marked out, but also him kind of taking that on as an identity.
Yeah, it's a really powerful moment in the novel, that acknowledgement that actually he maybe isn't as unlike others as he thought.
Yeah.
And I guess that's part of what it is to be a teenager as well, to feel that you're bristling against the structures that are kind of constraining you. And certainly the school and Compton Manor itself is one of those structures. But there's this interesting ambivalence in it, because it's a sort of quite a hippie bohemian space in some ways, and really disciplined in others. And I wondered sort of how you found your way to creating that as an environment that Jean would be in, and that's something, he also, I guess his character is thrown into relief by that environment as well.
I keep saying, well, there's two reasons for it, but there is a kind of structural, very kind of craft-based or practical reason behind that, which is when I was writing the novel, it spanned 80 years and like 40 locations, and there was like so much going on. And actually it was when I found the theatre of the school that I was able to create the drama. It was the limitations of that, like restricting where your character can go and who they can see and how many times they speak to people is what kind of builds friction. And I knew he went to a school like this. I was also interested in the kind of explosion of alternative teaching methods in the latter half of the 20th century, and their kind of connection to tradition, but their also attempt at something liberal and new. So there are schools like Summerhill. There are also quite a few other schools that are now closed that I looked at. So I wanted the school to feel both kind of protected from the world. So 1976 is a crucial time period in terms of its proximity to and distance from the Second World War. So feeling the aftershocks of it, but also kind of marking the birth of a new nihilism that emerged at the time that sort of rejected the socialism of the 50s and the liberalism of the 60s. But the school, I didn't want, when you read a book set in the 70s, it's not like they walk down the street in their bell bottoms, everyone just wears trousers and looks normal. So I kind of needed a setting that could couch that.
Yeah, it's really striking because I feel like there are certain narratives about the 70s that are sort of very utopian and even romantic, I think. The idea that it was, completely an era of liberation, and in many ways it was, and it was sort of the fruits of many liberation movements, I guess, were being sort of explored at that time. But it does feel like an era of decline in this novel, or of decay and risk even, right?
Yeah.
The sense that something in the outside world is shifting. You can even see that play out sort of in miniature within the school itself.
There was one moment, I feel like there were two different 70s I could have gone into.
Right.
And when I used to have some passages of him in London when he went to Andrew Logan's first Alternative Miss World.
Alternative Miss World.
Which you will know
Yes.
way more about than me as an expert on flamboyance. But writing that scene was like really bad fancy dress. It was honestly so crap. So I was like, I don't think that we can spend much time here. And I guess the flips, and also I was like, I'm not sure how much Jean has found or accessed these queer spaces in London yet. Maybe in another lifetime, or when he's a bit older, perhaps. But I think he grew up in West London, much greater access to the music scene that was burgeoning around there. And so the other side of the 70s, this sense of nuclear threat, of sort of complete annihilation, very high unemployment rates. It actually was, at the time, the hottest summer on record. The bin men did go on strike. There was a sort of sense of impending disaster and doom, and I think that's what I was drawing on, and I guess from a kind of pathetic fallacy perspective, it was most useful to me.
Completely, and I think in some sense within the narrative it raises the stakes. We wonder what the world that Jean is disappearing into is like, right?
Yeah.
And we see that sort of seep through, I think, within the story. You mentioned this sense that, like, not being sure how often Jean has discovered those queer spaces, and I think one of the things I found striking is he's perhaps only just even beginning to recognise himself as queer in this novel, or beginning to recognise his desires, and Tom certainly brings those out in him. Of course, he's had other encounters which we learn about later in the novel. But it's a love story of sorts, and it's a queer coming of age. These things feel very much related. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you write about the intimacy between these boys. It's a really sexy novel. And the sex scenes are really striking, I think. You really get the sense coming through that this is someone discovering the tastes and the smells and the textures of sex for the first time. And they keep us sort of really close to these encounters. And I imagine, I've never written fiction, but I imagine, because there's so much discourse about it, that writing sex is really hard, right? There's so many conversations about good sex scenes and bad sex scenes. How did you meet that challenge?
Oh, with a lot of difficulty. It was really hard. I think one of the things that I focused on in the book in general with all scenes was thinking about the corporeality of the characters. So thinking about them as bodies in space. There's a lot of touches and glances and movements and small gestures. And so when I came to the sex scenes, I approached them with that same attention to detail of thinking about bodies in space. And I actually did take a class when I studied at NYU, and one of the classes I took was with a writer called Garth Greenwell, who I would say is like godfather of queer sex scenes,
Yeah.
maybe grandfather and mother as well.
All of the above.
Of at
Yeah.
least like, you know, recent contemporary fiction queer
Yeah.
sex scenes. And his whole class was on sex writing. So we
Wow.
read really widely. We read Lady Chatterley's Lover, but we also read Yoko Ogawa, who is a Japanese writer, and we read Hotel Iris, which has like really intense S&M scenes in it. We also read Jeanette Winterson. We read contemporary American fiction. We read Colette. So we had this real like sexual palette, I suppose, to use film. But something that he really taught me was specificity and bodies in space. Having said that, I also got a lot of people to read them, and you know, there were some smells that got cut. You know,
Really?
there were some really bad similes that got cut, and actually, even in my copy edit, I was cutting some metaphors because I just thought, no, this like we don't need the snake, you know.
What could the snake be?
Yeah, I just didn't want to know. But yeah, it was with difficulty, and just to touch on what you were saying about Jean discovering his queerness in queer spaces, I think that again the boarding school was really important for that, as a place that both kind of is a generator of, but also a denier of queerness. I feel like it's sort of embedded in the mythos of the English boys' boarding school.
Totally.
But as something that is totally deniable. It's
Yeah.
not an identity. It's
Yeah.
things people do, but they are never queer.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's going on between Jean and Tom.
Yeah. It's like peak no homo, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's this like sexual exploration in this homosocial environment that's never named as queer or even as deviant.
No.
It has almost a kind of ritualistic feel in this novel. And part of that is to do with the way that sex so often in this environment feels like it's on the brink of violence. Like
Yeah.
they're very much connected. I think there's a moment when Jean and Tom are having sex and Jean is thinking about Roman soldiers wrestling and fighting.
Yeah.
Feels like we're never far away from the sort of threat of violence.
Because that's the other time that they touch each other. Is
Right.
when they hit each other.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Which also has its own kind of erotics as well, right? That
Yeah.
it's a way of expressing something. And in that sense, it feels like it is a novel about masculinity as well, and about gender and perhaps the boxes that these boys are sort of forced into. The other strain of violence in the novel, it's not quite the same, but it feels like love and violence and the relationship between them is also there in Jean's relationship with his mother.
Yeah.
Who's the most prominent female character in the book, really important character, I think a fascinating character. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about their relationship.
Yeah, I feel like there's the surface level tragedy of Jean
Yeah.
and Tom's relationship, but the kind of deeper tragedy and the maybe the greater tragedy that leads to that is the one with his mother. And I feel extremely fond of Rosa. Not just because she's one of two female characters in the book that I identify with her most, but I guess this is a book about the different ways people love each other but inadvertently cause harm, and the way that love is not the way the other person needs or wants to be loved. So the way Rosa relates to Jean stems from her own insecurities, her own life experiences. She is incredibly lonely and he's her only child, her golden boy son, and she's so sort of desperate to have an intimate relationship with him, and yet the way he is made sort of defies that and pushes against it. And so what she reaches for and what she's trying to do, how she tries to care for him, is actually what causes him pain and causes him harm. Her need to be in contact all the time, her need to call him, her want things that almost seem pedestrian, like talking about her day or experience violently. And then there are also acts of violence because she becomes frustrated, he's aggressive, she throws a plate, you know. There are instances, I have a lot of people read it and think, wow, she's a monster. I don't see her that way at all. These sort of acts of when she tries to touch him or hug him or hold him or caress him, or she becomes frustrated and loses her temper. So yeah, it's woven in there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Some of the most painful moments in the novel, I think, are the encounters between them, the conversations, or the, as you say, the miscommunications a lot of the time, right? That sort of break down in how they're able to love each other. And the scenes when we see Jean in London at home with Rosa and in that world feel fascinating because they also, in some ways, inform his own interests. Like, as any angry teenager must be, he's like obsessed with the counterculture, and is sort of steeped in those other imagined worlds of places he could be. He's into Zen Buddhism, he loves Bruce Lee, and I wondered, yeah, sort of how you went about building that world. It feels like there's a relationship between the artistic life that Rosa is living as his mother, and the thing that I guess that he's rebelling against, but also maybe borrowing from her world, right? Her influences.
Yeah. Like, even though he rejects her direct desires, so she would love him to go to art school and be a sculptor, and he's, you know, doesn't want to do that because it's kind of something that she's thrusting upon him. He's still actually a very cultured young man and interested in books and politics. That I built up, I suppose. Yeah, it sort of started small and then grew. I mean, I watched a lot of Bruce Lee films. I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I was, you know, I was looking at kind of the different strands, and it felt a bit too kind of, I mean, punk hadn't really begun yet. It was just, it would have begun like in the October after, but also that felt a bit too maybe straightforward to reach for. I wanted to give him, I guess, a rich inner world that was grounded in something bigger than himself, because Jean is also very violent himself. He you know, as you've heard, he commits acts of violence, and I kind of wanted to counter that with this desire, this Zen, this desire for something calmer and more interior.
It also feels like that's his own respite from the school itself.
Yeah.
This inner world. It's a place that he can retreat to. And
I think respite from everywhere. You know, he's always had it, and it comes from a character in the book called Mickey, who is a much older. He's an older, faded rock star who lives near Jean, and is a kind of surrogate father. But then that relationship also turns kind of erotic and a bit sinister.
There are so many of these relationships in the novel that feel like they, maybe fail is not quite the right word, but there are all kinds of difficulties in his relationship to adults, right? And Rosa is one of them. Mickey is another. As you say, it has a sinister edge. And there are also the teachers in the school as well, who I found really fascinating figures. They sort of represent quite different kinds of authority. We have David, who is presiding over the school. It's this very ultimately quite conservative, disciplined man, although it's a kind of hippie, experimental school in other ways.
He has strong Christian morals.
And then Charles, who is, let's say, eccentric. He's stroking a rabbit during class. He's wearing his patterned shirts. He feels like he's, you know, you could place him in the world outside of the school very easily, as well as within its experimental atmosphere. And did it feel important that those were there as other kinds of authority figures? Because they're certainly quite dominant really throughout the novel as figures that Jean is looking, not necessarily looking up to, but certainly looking at, right, and resisting a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think part of the novel, what I was interested in was, you know, we talk about him being a teenager, but the concept of adolescence was so new at that time as well, and it's set in a period when, I mean, now we have very sort of clear boundaries of of the different ages and what we expect from a person at any given age, and how they are distinct from each other, and the kind of the lines that are crossed. Whereas I think in this environment, and certainly which is influenced by the time period, those boundaries are not as clear. So the experience of being a teenager is more violent in that the way you are treated by the adults around you shifts. Sometimes you're a child, sometimes you're an adult. I mean, now Jean's 17, he's sort of considered an adult by a lot of older figures, and yet he's also still in a school environment. So I wanted those sort of role model figures to push against that, to push against this kind of desire to be older but also still feel the limitations of your power.
Yeah, and they are these ambivalent figures in that sense, that they're sort of espousing certain kinds of discipline and then very lax in other ways. It's interesting you point out the way that I guess the category of adolescence is different in the 70s from what we're used to now. One of the things that's also striking, this is a narrative of disappearance, is thinking historically this was a moment when it was possible to disappear in ways that feel almost unthinkable today, with the digital world and the imprint, the footprint that we all leave. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. It's not in the novel in any explicit way, but it was something that was on my mind a lot when I was reading it, that this felt historically particular in a way, that to be a teenager who could simply disappear.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I wanted to write a novel initially about disappearance, but that isn't what this novel's about. But because of the family member who did walk out and never came back, I was interested in how you can do that. And I mean, legally in the UK, if you choose to disappear, you choose to go missing, that's your human right. If the police find you and you say, I don't want to be found, don't tell my family you found me, legally they can't. And that has a lot of benefits for people fleeing dangerous situations. But also, I suppose in this particular one, it's complicated. You don't even know if they were found. You can also change your name without telling anyone. And if there's no digital trail and no paper trail at that time, it's just very easy to walk away and never come back. So it's something that's always preoccupied me and still preoccupies me, I think. It's in like a future book that I'm thinking of. I'm a big fan of Patrick Modiano, he's actually a Nobel winner. He's a French writer, writing about the sort of post-war France, where people are they feel unmoored and untethered from their identities, and there's a lot of addresses that no longer exist, names that are forgotten. They're sort of set up like detective stories, but nothing's resolved. And he's actually the epigraph of the book. So it's something that kind of infiltrates it, like what it means to disappear and how you can do that.
I love the epigraph.
Oh.
I wasn't truly myself except the moment I was running away. It feels like it really speaks to the concern at the heart of the novel, that actually we meet a person in their sort of in the moment that they're leaving, right, or that they're finding a sort of a different identity through a form of disappearance. And as you say, that's not explicit within the novel, but it feels like it's there on the horizon. It's something that Jean wants to do. I'm going to open up for questions in a minute, so please do have a think about anything you want to ask Maddie. But before I do, I had one last question, which was, I suppose, thinking about what your main influences were on this book. And you talked about the writers you studied as part of the course at NYU, but whether there were other particular novels or writers that really informed your thinking and your writing.
There's a really beautiful book called Reunion by Fred Ullman. It's a very short novella about a friendship between two boys in 1936 Stuttgart, one is a young Jewish boy and the other is a sort of aristocratic boy, and how that friendship is torn apart by the beginning of the war. That was very influential when I was thinking about young male friendship. It's a bit cliche to say, but Virginia Woolf was very influential when thinking about describing nature and landscape. Her novel, The Years, each chapter is punctuated with a paragraph just about the sky or a field or landscapes. And there was another novel by Madeleine Dunnigan called Do Not Say We Have Nothing, which is an epic about a family, a Chinese family in China, but also those members who have emigrated to Canada. And that that was useful when thinking about kind of stories that are passed down through families. So there's 3.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'm actually currently halfway through, so enjoying it greatly. I suppose I'm just really curious because I think obviously a lot of work has gone into this, and I was really interested in, I mean, the range of topics it covers, right? You obviously mentioned disappearance, but adolescence, sexuality, identity, and you've obviously done a lot of research into it. And I was just wondering, was there anything that you were particularly curious about? Something you didn't know before that obviously you were going to explore, but you were particularly interested in getting under the skin of and really, delving deeper?
Yeah, thank you. So the things I really enjoyed researching when I did them were often the kind of more nature-based or kind of graphic things. So there's this quite long scene of a butchery of a cow, which I really enjoyed researching. It was kind of difficult to do because I was in America at the time, and butchery of beef in America is different. They have different cuts to the UK, so I had to kind of use a VPN to get the UK cuts of meat. And researching the landscape, I was really interested in kind of like how I could fold in the history of the landscape and the history of the place into the story, so that it's not, you know, essential to character, but it kind of mirrors and enhances and is related to character. So those were things that I really enjoyed researching and was really interested in researching. I was really curious about again, this kind of the things Jean was interested in, because they were not necessarily things that came naturally to me. So the Buddhism, the meditation, Bruce Lee. Like I was like, let's watch loads of Bruce Lee films, you know. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Did you like research then as you went along, or was it like you kind of had? Yeah, I guess I'm just interested in like the process of writing a novel or this novel. It's like, did you have like a big kind of research time and then you were sort of like, no, okay, now I'm gonna delve in, or was it like more fluid?
It was both. I think writing this book, because it was my first book, I wasn't just kind of like learning how to tell Jean's story, I was learning how to write a novel from scratch. So I did have quite a long period of research. I, you know, read a lot. My dad actually made me a film list, which was very sweet and very useful. And yeah, I had kind of, I think for me, they do work in tandem though. So even in a period of research, I'll probably write things alongside, which I may never use, but they're kind of a way of processing that research into fiction. My sister is actually a really brilliant researcher and has spent years researching a book about our family history and writing it, and has this patience that you need for like really deep research, going to archives, spending weeks in a country, making those notes. And what I have learned is that that is not me, actually. Like, I really don't have the patience, and I find it like when I'm in an archive, I kind of feel itchy, and I want to leave almost immediately. So the beauty of writing fiction is kind of how mercenary you can be, like a magpie. So there were periods of long research, but then there were also kind of short bursts. Like I spent a morning learning how to butcher a cow and watching YouTube videos of how to like cart wool, and then I could spend the afternoon writing about it.
I can imagine there's a kind of freedom in that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a freedom in it. I say, like, maybe some would say sloppiness. I don't know, like.
Let's go with freedom.
There's a freedom, yeah. It's, yeah, and it kind of, because research is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
If you, far more than me, but you don't know what you're going to use or what's relevant, and you kind of need all of it. But the kind of joy of writing the novel is, or at least for me, I can, because I'm coming from with a strategy, as it were, or with a perspective, with a point of view, I can be more selective in what I choose to pick up and look at.
And finding the core of the story in that material as well,
Yeah.
and how it serves that story.
And not letting the material overwhelm the story.
Yes.
Like, which is why I think it needed to be in the school again, and it's not kind of, it is set in the 70s and that's part of it, but it's not like drenched in it.
Yeah, it feels historically particular, but as you say, it's not drenched in it. It's interesting you were talking about a film list, because it feels very cinematic to me.
Yeah.
I guess it's not the first time you've heard that. Like, was that part of the process?
That was part of the process. And I suppose, like, if I'm trying to pitch it, I often say in English, call me by your name, but it was the film, not the book.
Not the book, the film.
That was more influential. Yeah. Well, I mean, that was thinking about kind of sun-drenched spaces and how people interact close as well. Wonderful film, incredibly heartbreaking, about, it's a French film, two young boys, 10, maybe younger.
Yeah.
And it has a very sad turn. It's about their friendship, and there's a sad turn in it. That was really important.
There's also something about adolescent love that I think is there in Jean as well, and particularly there in Call Me By Your Name, about fantasy almost, or idealisation as well, the sun-drenched moment, the sort of perfect image that can only last for a certain amount of time, but we feel like we get those snapshots within the novel as well.
And that's why, it's only set over one summer, it's kind of within a 2-month period, and there's all this bristling with potential, because they feel like they're about to step into the world. They sort of feel like they can do anything, but also they can't really conceive of the future. They're so present in the moment.
Yeah. And so living in such a full way, right? In such a full-bodied way. We've probably got time for one more question. Anyone else?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Very trivial question. I remember the summer of 1976 as a boiling hot one. It was a terrible drought. It was so hot nobody could do anything. And I was wondering if that's a part of the novel, because it's very intense physically.
Yeah.
Does that come into it?
That's crucial to it. Yeah. So it's very, very hot, and they spend most of their time sitting by a lake smoking weed and kind of talking about making plans for the future that they know will never really exist. And the heat becomes something that's both kind of, I guess, part of this fantasy land between them, but also it's sort of stifling. It kind of preserves them, and then it's broken.
Yeah, it feels sweaty and sticky. I'm going to be cheeky and actually ask one more question.
Yeah, no, do.
Which is how much you can tell us, if you can, about what you're working on next. Would love to hear. I'm so curious.
Yes. I am working on my second novel, which I think I Don't Think I Know is about teenage girls this time, but a bit younger and set in the 21st century, who become obsessed with blood. So if this is kind of quiet and tempered and kind of restrained, I would say that is the opposite. It's excessive and camp and gory.
Great.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Maddie. It's been fascinating to hear about the process behind the story and how you brought it into being.
Thank you for
Thank
such a
you.
wonderful discussion. Thank you.